The brand new open field legendary archer commander Alp Arslan is one of the most complicated legendary commanders we have ever seen in Rise of Kingdoms history, and so I have spent the last day or two really breaking down his kit and trying to understand its complexities. And I honestly think that there are a couple of synergies with talents, with equipment, and with armaments that people aren't considering that could definitely unlock more damage for him when he's out on the field. So today we're going to cover everything you need to know about Alp. We'll talk about best commander pairs, best talent builds, and we'll also touch on some of those hidden things that I think a lot of people miss when it comes to maximizing his damage in the field. And then finally, I'm going to share with you guys my opinion on Alp. I'll let you know if I think he is a must-have commander. Is he going to find himself in a single archer lineup or a 2 archer lineup, or is he realistically going to be a 3rd archer lineup commander? We're going to cover all of that in this video, but before we jump in, of course, what's going on, guys? Cheers. Now, as you guys know, I am a sponsored partner creator with Rise of Kingdoms, so if you want more Rise of Kingdoms content, drop a thumbs up down below. It is the #1 best way to support your favorite creators, and we're also so close to 100,000 subs, so consider subscribing and double check. You might think you're sub, but you're not. Okay, with all of that out of the way, let's do a deep dive into Alp and talk about some of the things that you might have missed with his initial skill reveal. I think a lot of the area of opportunity for Alp comes in the form of both the 2-headed eagle skill and the 4th skill, Parthian shot. Now, I actually reached out to support for a little bit more clarification on how 2-headed eagle actually works with regards to spreading the debuffs from the current target to the 3 non-target enemy troops. And my specific question was, is there a way to determine which of these debuffs are going to be applied? For example, let's say the target you're hitting is inflicted with a pierce, poison, slow, and a health debuff all at the same exact time. That is 4 debuffs, and this is only spreading 2 of them. So how does the game determine which of the 2 will actually be spread to the nearby enemies, right? And the answer is that it is random, which is very unfortunate. That is not the answer that I wanted to hear. I was hoping that maybe there was a hierarchy of debuff prioritization here where it would prioritize spreading pierce, because of course that is what he is known for. That's kind of his thing, right? It's on 2 of his skills, and then behind that it would be poison, because that is what is kind of unique to archers themselves, and then beyond that it would go to slow and normal debuffs, right? But unfortunately that is not the case. So if your target is inflicted with multiple debuffs all on the same time that this actually triggers, then you will be spreading 2 of those 4 at random. Okay, now there's a couple of ways you can think about this. First of all, you could just say, all right, well, let's stack as many debuffs on the target as possible, and we'll just roll the dice every single time the benevolence effect triggers, and hopefully it spreads pierce and poison, right? Because especially poison would be exceptionally good to spread here. We'll talk about that later in the video when we talk about some of the best pairings. But I also want to touch on Parthian shot here, because this skill I feel like didn't get that much attention when all of us sort of covered this new commander reveal. A lot of the attention was placed on the active skill, the damage factor being low, the pierce effect and how pierce works, and then of course the 2-headed eagle skill itself. Okay, and we've all been thinking about what are the best pairs for this. Is it Herman? Is it Jajar? Is it just going to be Emperor Jin? But I think Parthian shot is actually an area of opportunity where players can really siphon out a ton more value from Alp himself. Okay, and the reason for that is because this skill does not have a cooldown, and you can deal 1,000 damage here. Okay, so really quick, just to recap, when using an active skill, this commander's troop deals direct damage to the target equal to the number of debuffs on the target times 100 for a maximum of 1,000, which means every time you deal an active skill, you want the target to have at least 10 debuffs on them every single time, right? Because again, there is no cooldown listed on this skill. Your primary cast their active skill, this skill will trigger, and then your secondary cast their active skill, this will trigger again, and then you'll build up the debuffs for the next skill cycle. And the key here is that this skill doesn't remove the debuffs from the target when you deal 1,000 damage, right? A lot of times with other commanders, you know, you'll stack something up and then spend those stacks to deal a lot of damage. I think like with Sargon, for example, that's kind of how this works. I think Chandragupta has something like that. But with Parthian shot, the game will just check to see number of debuffs equals X and then deal the appropriate damage. So if the target has 10 or more debuffs on them, for your primary commander, you'll deal 1,000, and then when the secondary commander casts their active active skill, the game will just run that check again, and if the target still has 10 or more stacks of debuffs, you'll hit them with another 1,000. Now of course this has to be tested. That's my understanding based on the wording of this. I guess technically this might only apply for Alp himself, right? It might not apply for the secondary, but there's really no wording here that suggests that. It's just maybe that's the case, because it doesn't say when this commander uses an active skill, it specifies this commander's troop deals direct damage, and when this commander is in a field troop, so they're implying the actual army itself is what triggers this, not specifically Alp. Now again, it has to be tested. We don't know for sure, but more likely than not, it's going to just be whenever you do an active skill, Parthian shot gets triggered, right? Again, there's no cooldown here, which is kind of insane, especially on the second bullet point. When you deal skill damage, you have a 50% chance to take 10% less damage for 3 seconds. Well, your active skill on Alp is going to be skill damage, and then Parthian shot is also skill damage, so you've got 2 chances to take 10% less damage. And then your secondary commander, whether that's Herman, whether that's whoever, I guess if it's Shajar this won't work, but assuming both commanders are dealing skill damage, the secondary is also going to give you a 50% chance to take 10% less damage. So I feel like this is actually going to be up a lot more often than you might think. Okay, so all of that being said, for the first skill cycle, you're gonna feel like the damage factor here is a bit low, because I mean 2,000 is low, and then the pierce stacks take time to stack up to deal as much damage as possible. Even on the first skill cycle though, you'll probably be dealing upwards of 3,500 with this active skill, but after you've stacked all your debuffs, it's actually 4,500 every single active skill with Parthian shot, which is kind of insane when you really think about it. The only condition there is, okay, well, how do we make sure that the target has 10 or more debuffs every single time you cast an active skill? And that's what we're going to talk about in this video, folks. Now here's the thing, based on the wording here, right, number of debuffs, is that going to be based on the different types of debuffs, or is that number of stacks of debuffs on the target, right? My assumption, if it's number of stacks of debuffs, then this is insane. If it is different number of debuffs, then it might be a little challenging to reach that 10 every single time. So we'll have to wait and see. By that I mean, you know, if you have 3 stacks of pierce on the target, is that 3 different debuffs, or does that count as one? It's just the pierce debuff, right? Same thing with the expertise here. When you inflict a debuff, inflicted targets lose 5% defense. Okay, so that's another debuff. So Father of Conquests, that is a second type of debuff, but it can stack up to 2 times. So will that count as 2, or will it count as 1? And I don't mean to repeat myself too much here, but if multiple stacks of the same debuff count as number of debuffs, then this is going to be wild, right? Because again, you're probably going to pair him with somebody like Herman Prime, who's going to be dealing a lot of stacks of poison, and poison can stack up to 15 times, and you're not going to clear that with Herman at all. If anything, you're going to spread it more with Two-Headed Eagle. With that being said, let's talk about a couple of different talents that I think are going to be super important when using Alp in the open field. And the very first thing we have to talk about is actually this talent build right here, and this actually grabs Cage of Thorns. Cage of Thorns is going to be very good, I think, on Alp, depending on a lot of different factors, but this is an AoE slowdown. Now, having only 1 point here is a 5% march speed reduction. It's not that big of a deal, right? But the fact that it affects up to 5 nearby enemies means that everyone around you is going to have at least 1 debuff every single time the secondary commander casts their active skill, right? On top of that, the Two-Headed Eagle skill can actually spread this Cage of Thorns to other enemies in the battlefield, and so maybe you would actually want to stack this up to 5 times if what you want is to spread a lot of slowdown, because this is again an AoE slowdown that you will spread AoE with Two-Headed Eagle. It's like kind of insane. It almost might be detrimental because the nearby enemies might already have the Cage of Thorns, so who knows how that's going to work. But I wanted to at least mention this here. I think a lot of people forget about Cage of Thorns because typically we just put 2 points into rejuvenate, but I think with Alp, the name of the game is going to be getting the maximum number of different debuffs on the target, so that way you are always dealing the maximum amount of damage with Parthian shot. Okay, and so Cage of Thorns here, if anything, is just another point on the debuff counter to deal more damage with Parthian shot. Additionally, Cage of Thorns has no cooldown, right? So you're going to cast this for your primary and then you're going to cast it for your secondary, and on top of that, with Herman Prime, which is who we're talking about, his expertise casts his active skill more frequently as well. So you're going to be getting Cage of Thorns pretty often, which means your targets are often going to have at least this one debuff on top of the poison, on top of the pierce that is guaranteed from those active skills already, right? So during a single skill cycle for both commanders, that is 3 different debuffs every single time guaranteed. But it actually gets even better than that, because the Father of Conquest's expertise on Alp is also going to trigger off of Cage of Thorns, and again, there's no cooldown. So what happens is your primary casts their active skill, Cage of Thorns, secondary casts their active skill, Cage of Thorns, and so now the enemies have a 10% march speed reduction and they have a 10% defense reduction from the expertise on Alp. So it's not 3 debuffs strictly from the active skills, it's actually 4 debuffs from the active skills if you include this normal debuff, which is kind of insane, and you can see how quickly these things can stack up. I mean, Cage of Thorns literally turns the expertise here into a 5 target AoE defense reduction, although technically I know it says you can trigger up to 3 times per second, so maybe only 3 nearby enemies are going to get the defense reduction, not all 5 of them. We'll have to test and see, but even still, that is still a very good and very easy way to give 10% defense reduction to nearby enemies and increase the debuff counter. So that's the support tree. Okay, and again, we're going to talk about best pairings later, but this is a build that we might want to test just to see how impactful that free extra debuff is all the time. If this doesn't work how I think, or if you don't get as much value from Parthian shot as I'm expecting, then you probably would just run your standard support build like we always do. If we're talking about the skill tree, which is what Alp has himself, then we may actually want to consider grabbing latent power here. I'm not, again, we have to test this because I'm not entirely sure, but of course latent power is often skipped because it enhances additional damage, not skill damage, right? Which is really what you want from the skill tree. But when we look at Alp's kit himself, his pierce damage is additional damage. It specifies that right here. Okay, you're going to be dealing a lot of damage with the pierce stacks, and frankly there's not really a better option here for Alp, because typically, like, this is what most people do, right? They either put 3 points into rapid fire and 1 into full quiver, or they switch those around if they want more attack than normal damage, right? But like, really, like that's all rounding errors, whereas with Alp I think this is a meaningful increase in damage if this works how I think it will, in that it will increase the damage dealt by the pierce stacks. Okay, so now that we've talked about talents, let's talk about accessories and ways that I think we can squeeze a little bit more value out of Alp himself. Okay, now for me, I suspect that the best 2 accessories for Alp are going to be the ring and the horn. I think that's kind of like, I mean, that's the meta. I think the pendant of eternal night is still going to be mainly just an Emperor Chin exclusive, and so the safest thing is ring and horn. But I do want to bring your attention to the concealed dagger and to Mora's web, because as I said before, the name of the game for Parthian shot may be just having the most number of unique debuffs on the target at any given time, right? So concealed dagger and Mora's web are in a very unique position where this is just an additional source of normal debuffs on the target in your accessory slot. So while it might not be best in class for Alp himself, of course we'll have to test it, some players may still have a concealed dagger or Mora's web depending on if you dismantled them during the recent event that came around. I myself did actually keep my concealed dagger because I'm toying with the idea of expanding to 6 armies, and so I'd rather have a legendary accessory in the slot than not. I might dismantle this, but we'll have to wait and see how Alp actually works with that accessory. But my point is, the concealed dagger and Mora's web are basically irrelevant in almost every PvP exchange that we have in the game, but in this case we're not so much concerned about the percent of debuff, right? We're just concerned about the fact that it's another debuff for the debuff counter to make sure that we're dealing maximum damage with Parthian shot every single time, right? So again, this is one of those scenarios where, okay, maybe you don't craft the concealed dagger or Mora's web for Alp himself, but if you still have those accessories, he might be a good place to put it, unless you're running it on your combo cabs, because of course it's going to trigger more there, but definitely something that we have to at least pay attention to and test. And I am particularly interested in Moore's Web. Unfortunately I don't have one anymore, but does this count as two different debuffs if you're hitting cavalry, right? That's really what I want to know. I don't remember. I used to have Moore's Web, I don't anymore. So if you guys have this, if you could check the battle log and see if when you inflict this on cavalry, does it show up as two different debuffs, or is it just the one debuff that just happens to do more on calves? I'm curious how that actually works. You can let me know in the comments, but either way, I wanted to at least bring this up for those of you and for those of us that still have at least one of these accessories. This might be a hidden gem for Alp that can maximize his damage with Parthian shot every single time you cast your active skill, which I kind of like a lot. It kind of adds a little bit of relevance to some of the accessories that most of us have kind of thrown in the garbage. The other piece of equipment we have to talk about that I think a lot of people missed is that the tier 5 gloves, the legendary gloves, whether it's your leadership, archer, infantry, cav, whatever, it doesn't matter, all tier 5 gloves actually have a march speed debuff on the target. Okay, now again, if we're talking about Parthian shot, this is another debuff for that debuff counter to maximize the damage that you're dealing every single time that this triggers. Okay, and so you can see where, you know, again, the numerical value of the debuff is kind of irrelevant. We're just using these as part of the debuff counter, right? It reminds me back in the day when I played Yu-Gi-Oh, there was an Exodia deck where what you would do is you would play Royal Magical Library, and it basically gave you a counter every time you played a spell card. And so what you would do is you would just spam spell cards that basically didn't do anything. It just gave you counters, right? So for example, you would do like Toon Table of Contents to search for Toon Table of Contents to search for Toon Table of Contents to search for Toon World, and your deck didn't even use any Toon cards, right? It's just 4 spell cards to add counters. What the spell does itself is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Same sort of concept here that I'm thinking of is like, okay, we can just find all these different little debuffs that don't really matter on their own. It doesn't even matter what you're doing. All that matters is that you're getting the maximum number of debuffs, so that way your active skill goes from effectively 3,500 to 4,500 every single time that you cast, and that is a non-zero change. That is a big deal. That's effectively a 28% increase in the damage factor of your active skill, right? Like that's a big deal for all, especially because he's single target damage, and so you want to get the max value there. Now another thing I'll point out here is like the tier 5 for the chest, for example, it says you have a 10% chance to gain a 5% counterattack damage boost for 2 seconds. Does that count as an instance of a buff it's providing on the two-headed eagle skill, right? Because this is the other half of the skill that a lot of us kind of skipped over because it seems like Shajar synergy, which a lot of us don't really care about. But you know, you are providing buffs even without Shajar if things like this actually count, right? If buffing yourself counts as a buff it provides, then you are gonna have a chance to heal some of your units even without Shajar, right? Which is pretty cool. Now the reason that I'm on the fence here is because it says buffs it provides, which is like, when I think of the word provides, it sounds like it's something you're giving, right? You're giving a buff. Could you give yourself a buff? I guess that's true, right? Like if I'm gonna go get a coffee, am I providing myself with coffee? That doesn't seem like the right English word that you would use here if self buffs actually worked, but they might, right? So that's something you have to test, and if they do, certainly something like this would be relevant for getting as many buffs as possible, right? You would be playing the other side of the coin. You'd be playing the same game that we've been discussing this entire video, where okay, let's just see how many buffs we can stack on ourselves at all times, in which case something like the Ring of Doom would count as a buff you're providing yourself, right? Which would be kind of insane. So all of this comes down to testing, but the point of this video is just pointing out these little things that I honestly don't know if I heard many people talk about when this commander was first revealed, because there might be a lot of extra value we can squeeze out of Alp that a lot of people don't even think about. But back on the topic of providing debuffs that will maximize your damage from Parthian shots, I want to draw your attention to the special inscription Advantage Advanced, which is actually on the scroll here, and this is one that you can get from the KVK shop. So a lot of people are going to have this. If you convert your hunter, then you're going to have this as well, right? So this is probably the most common special inscription, but what you'll notice is that when you deal skill damage, it deals 10% more if the target has 50% or more units remaining, but if it doesn't, the target takes 2.5% more damage for the next 2 seconds. So that would be a debuff applied to the target, and is yet another source of debuffs for the Parthian shot. So if you're hitting weaker targets, you're dealing more debuffs. And remember, every time you deal one of these debuffs, regardless of if it's from, you know, Advantage Advanced, or if it's from the Concealed Dagger, or if it's from the March speed reduction on the gloves, or if it's from Cage of of thorns in the support tree, you're inflicting 5% defense to those targets, right? And this doesn't seem like much, but I think it will move the needle. So again, there's all these little sort of things that I want to draw your attention to, where I think there's a lot that's going on with Alp's kit, and at first glance it was sort of hard to get all the puzzle pieces together to see the complete picture of Alp, because a lot of us just looked at, okay, well, 2000 damage factor, he goes in the garbage, right? Like, and like, really, that's a reasonable knee-jerk reaction to have, and that might still be the case, right? I'm not saying that that's not the case. I'm not trying to convince you in this video that he's OP, that he's broken, but what I am trying to say is that with Parthian shot and the synergy with Two-Headed Eagle and Father of Conquests, I think that you're gonna have a commander that, okay, sure, he's not dealing as much damage as Emperor Qin, basically nobody is, right? But what you do have is a commander that's dealing respectable damage with arguably the best debuffing kit in the entire game right now. I mean, every debuff you deal is another debuff, and the more debuffs you deal, the more damage you deal, and you can spread existing debuffs to more targets to give more debuffs. Like, the supportive nature of Alp, I think, is the part that is deceptively good, and he will be dealing more damage as a result of that than we really thought just looking at the 2000 damage factor. Now, a quick thing I want to remind you guys is that one thing I was a little worried about is the active skill of Alp dealing a lot of additional damage factor, right? It's not skill damage necessarily, it is additional damage. And so I was worried about, like, you know, with wedge formation, are you gonna get the benefit of this 12% more skill damage because it is additional damage factor, as you can see here? But as far as I can tell, if we take a look at Seong-Gye's fourth skill, the underlined skill damage says that this includes direct damage and additional damage. And so my assumption is, and you guys can let me know in the comment section below, but any sort of boost or bonus to skill damage actually does apply to additional damage, but it's not the other way around, right? So in the talents, if something applies additional damage, it does not increase your skill damage. Basically, additional damage is a subsection of skill damage, right? So if something applies skill damage bonus, it applies to additional damage, but if something gives additional damage bonus, it does not go upwards in the other direction, the more broad category of skill damage. Okay, so that's how I'm assuming that works. So I don't think there's anything to worry about with the additional damage. I think you are still, you know, for every single damage that you deal with the pierce debuff stacks, I think you will still get all the benefits of bonus skill damage that you have, which is quite good. So with all of that being said, let's answer the two questions that I posed before. What are the best pairs for Alp, and is he a must-have archer commander, yes or no? And really, I think when I tell you who the best commander pairs probably are, I think that's going to answer the must-have or not question, okay? Because I do think that his best pairing is going to be Hermann Prime, with Shajar being a runner-up, okay? And any archer commander that lands in the game whose best pairing isn't Emperor Qin, then you know that they will be at least a second archer army commander. And so if you're a free-to-play player, this is actually really good news, because that means that if you're only running one archer army, which a lot of people are, then Alp is pretty much not a must-have commander, really. I really, even though we spent all video talking about how, you know, he's solid, and he's actually probably better than we think, and we'll have to test to find out, but with all the different things that we've touched on here, I think it's easy to assume that his fourth skill is going to deal a lot more damage than we thought, and so he's probably going to perform a lot better than we thought, similar to Gangnam Chan or whatever. That being said, though, Emperor Qin is just so good that Alp himself, I don't think, finds himself in the single best archer march, because there's not as much synergy with Alp and Emperor Qin as there is with Emperor Qin and Zhuye Liang or with YSG, right? I think that's like abundantly clear. And so if you're only running one archer march, you probably don't need Alp at all. But I will say that for a second archer march, I think he's going to be deceptively good, such that the two archer lineup might be better than the two cavalry lineup at this point, depending on if you have Attila or Hector or not. If you have Attila and Hector, then I think maybe we're kind of neck and neck here because of the pairings you could do with either Arthur with Hector, or, you know, Attila with Achilles. You know, there's a lot of different options there. If you don't have those commanders, though, you might be better off doing a two archer lineup with 2 infantry and 1 cavalry. That's kind of how I'm looking at this. Okay, now if you are doing that, if you're running 2 archers, or if you're going to flex into running 2 archers, which by the way, I am probably going to build a second archer set of gear and armaments. It's actually not just because of Alp, it's just because of how bad my second cav army did this last KVK, and really there's no excuse for that because our enemies were noticeably weaker than us. That's not a dig at them, it's just matchmaking was rough, right? I talked about that in a previous video, but this KVK, my second cav army should have done a lot better than it did. It just didn't, so it is what it is. So I'm probably going to be building a second archer army, and that means I'll need to have Alp, right? And so the best pairing I think is Hermann Prime, and whether Hermann is primary or secondary is going to be the #1 thing to test. Now, as always, the skill tree will deal more damage, but the support tree recently got a pretty big buff in the form of loose formation and in the form of emergency protection, because now these reduce the amount of combo and smite damage that you take across the board, which is really good. I mean, that's really good. Loose formation alone is super good now, right? So that being said, I think there is an opportunity for Hermann Prime to be the primary and to really pop off in that way, especially if, you know, the stacks of Cage of Thorns that we apply, you know, that could really move the needle, right? And I would probably run something like this. The other advantage of running Hermann Prime as the primary is that the active skill is an AoE active skill, right? And so, you know, depending on the open field situation at the time, having the poison stacks hit first and then having Alp deal his 2000 damage factor, I think that is the order with which you would want to do these things, because troops take more skill damage when they have poison stacks, right? So right out of the gate, you hit your target with 2 stacks of poison. Now they're taking 6% more skill damage, and then you hit them with Alp with his 2000 damage factor, and then the pierce applies, and it's just ticking away the amount of health that they have. And the more poison they have, the more the pierce is going to do. And I think there's going to be a lot of synergy with that won't be immediately apparent, but I think, you know, the more Hermann Alps you have in the field, the more it's going to move the needle for your alliance, your kingdom, and that's going to be really interesting to discover when we do the testing. Again, if it turns out that it's not, you know, maybe you just want the skill tree, and so then you do all primary, and that's, you know, the way that you go. The downside there is that you have to make sure your Hermann cast is active skill, right? You want those poison stacks, you want the AoE damage. The argument for having the AoE as the primary commander is that the AoE deals more damage. You're dealing all that damage at once, whereas the pierce you're dealing over time, and so people might retreat back to their city, and then you don't get the max value there. So, you know, I do still think there's an argument for the AoE primary, especially because of the poison synergy there and the support tree. But again, this is something we'll have to test. Now, the final thing I want to touch on here that makes me think Hermann Prime is going to be the best pair for Alp is the expertise on Hermann Prime. It says whenever this commander's troop inflicts 25 stacks of poison on enemy troops, it triggers the Forest of Fallen Eagles skill at level 5. That is the active skill on Hermann Prime. Now, the thing with this is with the 10-second cooldown and with the speed with which you are giving the enemy poison stacks from the 4th skill and the active skill, you often would find that this skill triggers very slow. But what we know from Two-Headed Eagle is that you have the chance of spreading 2 stacks of poison to 3 different enemies. So that's a total of 6 more stacks of poison that you can spread, which should increase the counter of the expertise on Hermann, because this says whenever this commander's troop inflicts 25 stacks, and we know that stacks you apply with Tamiris, for example, do count towards the expertise on Hermann. And so it would stand to reason that if the skill on Alp is also spreading stacks of poison, then that should increase this counter as well. And it's almost like the developers are pointing us in this direction. I mean, we've got the Two-Headed Eagle skill and we've got the Forest of Fallen Eagle skills. I mean, they're both eagle skills. I think these commanders might actually belong together. The Shazar synergy, and I said this in my initial video, but the Shazar synergy seems like it is kind of almost an afterthought if you read the skills. It's just, I feel like the devs feel bad that Shazar just hasn't had literally any relevance almost at all since she landed in the game. And even if you're running like a 3-army lineup, you might not even be running Shazar, which is kind of crazy. So I feel like they kind of just threw in some synergy for her just to make it, you know, make it make sense. That being said, you know, this, if you're running a 3-archer lineup, you might run Alp with Shazar as, you know, Alp as the primary, Shazar as the secondary, so that way you get all the perks of this true damage, healing, and all that other stuff. And if you do that, then you're going to be super tanky, right? And you're going to get a lot of benefits of, you know, applying buffs to your nearby allies, and you're going to be reducing the defense of nearby enemies, and like there's a whole lot that you can do here, and this frankly might be even more supportive depending, but I personally am leaning towards the Hermann Prime as the primary or secondary. I think the Hermann Alp is going to be the play if you're running 2 archers, and if you're running 3 archers, maybe you're running, you know, the Shajar and the Alp together, and then you're running maybe Zhuge Liang with Hermann, and then you're running obviously the YSG behind the Emperor Qin. The other way people run this is they run you know, Qin YSG, then they run Zhuge Liang with Philip. In that case, maybe they would still run the Hermann with the Alp. Not really sure how that's going to go. I'm not a super big believer in the Zhuge Liang with Philip. I think that was good like 9 to 12 months ago, but some people still use it, and so I'm not going to argue with that. I personally don't use it, so I can't say for sure, but I've just really been you know, my last KVK, Philip was on the bench like the whole time, right? I mean, just the active skill, the buff is only 2 seconds. It's just, it really, he felt like a band-aid on a problem, and him being leadership and being universal and being able to go anywhere has been great. But I think now that we've got a whole new generation of commanders out, I think Philip has very quickly lost some of his relevance. Not saying that nobody uses him, and not saying that he can't be used or that he's not good. He still finds himself used in many ways, but I'm just feeling less hyped about Philip than I've ever felt before. Maybe that's a pair for Zhuge Liang, maybe it's not, I don't know. But all that being said, I am still putting my money on the Hermann being the #1 contender as best pair for Alp, which means I do not think he is a must-have commander, but I do think that he is stronger than we give him credit for, and only time will tell when testing finally starts to happen. Now, I will share some important information regarding the channel here. If you made it to the end, you're gonna get this little nugget of wisdom. Okay, I will be in Japan for 2.5 weeks, starting on I think the 4th we're leaving. I tell you that because, you know, unless Alp lands in the game in the next literally 2 days, I'm just not going to be able to release any content around testing him or anything like that. Not that I am often the guy that tests first or whatever, but the timing is just very bad. So I don't know when he's coming in the game at the time of recording this, and there's a very good chance I will be on vacation when he does land in the game, and so that kind of sucks. So I just want to let you guys know, if you're wondering like where's your updated Alp guide, where's your updated Archer guide or whatever, I just can't make one because I will not be here for any of the relevant testing data, right? So I'll probably do that when I get back. We'll have to wait and see. But really, in this video, I've kind of shared with you my predictions for the 2 and 3 army lineups for archers, so we'll have to see how accurate those predictions are when he does land in the game, and then I can say I told you so, or maybe I'll look like an idiot and he actually just completely sucks. But guys, with that being said, hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider dropping a thumbs up since you made it all the way to the end here. It really does help out the channel a ton. If just a third of you guys liked the video, that would move the needle tremendously for the video and for the channel. And while you're down there, consider subscribing to the channel. You might think you're subbed because you've seen my videos possibly for years, but you're not actually subbed. Double check down below, click the bell to be notified the next time I upload a Rise of Kingdoms video. And with that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching. This has been Omniarch. I'll talk to you guys again soon. Peace.